Well, for those people who are not here today, for whatever reason, that tape didn't take, so I'm going to have to retape it at home tonight and put the whole thing out there at that time. But I want to quickly go over Chapter 9, which is, thankfully, shorter than Chapter 8 was. It's about 20 pages long. All right? What they're starting to do in here is they're starting to talk to you about the effects that you can use using jQuery. The author says, as you study these methods, remember that the primary goal of a website is usability. Make sure your effects and animations don't detract from that goal. Again, it's the idea that you don't want to have so many bells and whistles that you include on a website that the person doesn't really know what the website's about. It's cool. What does it do? I don't know, but it's cool. That's not really going to help you. All right. So, for instance, on the project that we were working on for part of the semester here, the leavemeathome.com, think about what you may want to use in there for special effects. There may be nothing. Or, as an example, when the site comes up, you might want to take his business card and have it come on, in really big, real big on the screen, something like that. So there's a lot of ways that the stuff can potentially be used. So, as mentioned here, we go into some of the effects that can be used. Again, they're going to go back to the FAQ application using jQuery Effects, the slideshow using jQuery Effects, and then they get into animation. Now, you can go out online and find hundreds of examples of these things. Quite often what they'll do is they will create a div. Okay? You know what a div is. But they'll create a div and they'll put nothing in it at all. But what they'll do is they'll use CSS and make the div maybe 300 pixels high, 300 pixels wide, and make it red, for example. All right? And then use animation to make it slide across the screen, move up and down, fade in and out, etc. So that's the kind of thing that they're talking about in here. All right? Also, a couple things that you'll learn in here, just so you know. We'll talk about chaining. And with chaining, I can sit there and I can say, I want to grab, for example, this is a stupid example, but I want to grab all of my H2 headings and I want them to show for 5 seconds. Then I want them to hide for 10 seconds. Then I want them to show again for 3 seconds. What I'm showing you, the act of what's happening here is stupid. But chaining means something dot something dot something. Okay? Sometimes this chaining will go 10 or 15 deep. And just so you know when you write it, what you're allowed to do in here is I can write the same thing as h2 dot show for 5,000, then underneath it put dot hide for 10,000, then underneath that put dot show for 3,000. And the only reason I'm showing you that is normally it's not written like this. It's almost always going to be written like that. But that is still considered to be chaining. All right? And I just use show and hide. It can be all sorts of stuff. Not only can you show and hide things, but for example, you can add an entire class to something by using add class. You can remove an entire class from something. Remove class. All right? There's a toggle class to turn stuff on and off. So there's a lot of ways in which this can be used. Finally, they're going to come back with a carousel application, and they're going to show that using jQuery as well. All right? So it says the chapter starts by presenting the basic methods for effects that are provided by jQuery. All right? Afterwards, they're going to go through animation. All right? So some of the major things that you'd use are shown right here. Many of them, hopefully, just by looking at them, will make sense. Show and hide should make sense to you. Toggle does. Toggle says, if it's showing, hide it. If it's hidden, show it. All right? Slide up and slide down. Imagine it's kind of like a shade that you have in your bedroom, for example. And you can slide this shade up, or you can slide the shade down, or you can toggle it between those. Fade to. You've got your choice. You can have something fade into a page, fade out of a page, and you can fade toggle it as well. Notice there's also a fade to. And what that typically does is it works with opacity. So you might want something, rather than fading in or out, you just may want the opacity to change. So it's got either a more transparent or a more opaque type of look. And again, as always, there are examples of all of these that are shown here. I'm not running through these right now because my guess is most of you probably haven't read the chapter. If you have, great. But if you haven't, they're not going to make any sense anyway. So go over them with you. All right? But I would definitely take the time to read the chapter and go through it. Now notice, too, when you fade things and you do all this stuff, you give it a time. 5 seconds, etc. After 5 seconds, we want it to fade to 20% opacity, as an example. We want this to fade out, all right, in 5 seconds, and then slide down over 1 second. The reason I'm telling you that is you can put numbers in there, or you can leave nothing in there, all right? Notice it says you can put in there, I think that slow or fast, all right? Slow does it over 400 milliseconds, so 0.4 of a second. Fast will do it over 200. I guess slow is 600, fast is 200, and the default is 400. So you can do all sorts of different effects. And not every effect has to have the same amount of milliseconds, too. You can have something come in real fast and go out slow, etc. So as it says, that's the other thing, too. You see this in here. And people look at this and they're like, what the heck is that? If we look at what's in blue right here, all right, what this says is this: we should find something with the ID of startup message. We want it to fade over 5 seconds to 20% opacity. When it's done, we want this function to run. When you put a function on the end of one of these things, it's called a callback. Literally, you're saying that's what I want to have happen. So next, as it says, they come in here with the FAQ using Jquery Effects. All right. What kind of an effect would you want to use it here? Well, notice there's slide down and there's fade out. What can happen when you use this stuff, if you don't use effects, is something just bang, it's gone, and something else is there. And it can be kind of hard on a user. But rather than doing that, what you can do is have something softly fade out, and once it's gone, have something else fade in. All right? And that's what they're talking about in here with the slide down and the fade out methods. All right? So, again, a slideshow with special effects. So they come in here. It's the same one that we looked at before. All right? You can see the HTML. You can see the CSS, but now they're going to come in here. Notice 2 ways to code it with jQuery. I mentioned this to you before. Whether this is a good thing or not for me to say, but there's always more than one way of achieving the same result. So they're going to show you here on 268 2 different ways, it's really on 269, to write the same code to have the same thing happen. All right. You'll notice there's not much difference in the amount of code. So again, well, then which one do I use? That's not the question. You'll look at both of them and you see which one makes more sense to you. Because again, remember, being a first year and even a first semester student, you should be programming right now for understandability. You should grab, if you're going to use something like this, you should use the one that makes the most sense to you. All right. Now, when you're working with stuff, they've got a slideshow and they talk about how to stop it and start it. It may not sound like a big thing, but if you've got someone who has motor impaired, in other words, they can't use a mouse or do whatever, then you might want to set it up for them that they can stay on slides longer. All right, when you've got a slideshow, you can set it up. You know, you've typically, you saw this in Bootstrap. So if this was your slide, you had that, you had like 3 dashes or whatever down there. That was one way to move around. All right, and you can change these to other things, etc. But maybe you don't want it like that. Maybe you want it set up so there's none of that stuff there. And maybe there's 2 buttons here. All right, it says, for example, next, and not previous, but just pause. And then you let the person watch the slideshow at their own leisure. You just keep the slide there until they click next. When it gets to the end, you click next, it has to go back to the beginning again. But you can have it pause at any time. All right, that's just an example, maybe not a great one, but it's just different ways that you can do that. All right, so why does that matter? Well, notice what they're doing in here. For stopping and starting, they're using timers. All right, there's a set interval, for example, right there. All right. So it's the same stuff that you learned in JavaScript. We're just doing it a little bit different way. That's all. All right, and then most of the rest of the chapter, starting on page 272, goes into animation. All right, animation, as it says, typically uses the animate command. You can, again, have stuff move up and down, left to right, sideways, etc., however you want it or need it to happen on screen. Not only can you do that, you've got control over how it does that. There's somewhere around 20 or 30 ways you can have it bounce up on the screen. You can have it go in a certain cyclical way, etc. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be done. And they give you an example there, albeit not a very good one. All right. But as it says here, when the animate method is run, the CSS properties for the selected elements are changed to the properties in the properties map that's coded. So in other words, you're saying that as this runs, you might want to change its color. All right. Chaining, again, we've already talked about a little bit. So if we look at it again, how to chain animate methods. Okay. So we've got a this.animate and then another .animate, etc. This can be put on one line if you want to do that. Typically, people put it on more than one line, and they line up the dots, so to speak. Although again, you don't have to do that, just because it makes it easier when you're trying to debug it. That's all. So as it says here, whoops, sorry. When you chain the effects and animations for an element, they're placed in a queue. So in other words, what it does is it says to run the first one, then when you're done, then get the second one, grab it out of the queue and run that one. Then when that's done, grab the third one that's out of the queue and grab that one. That can be problematic. In other words, in the example that I gave you before, if I've got a slideshow, and let's say I've got these and I've got that again, or what if I'm in the middle of clicking this to go to the next slide, but it takes a second, and while that's going from one slide to the other, then I click this one. All right? It is possible for you to almost pause the application that you're working on because the system is, for lack of better words, kind of screwed up as far as what it wants. All right? The way that you typically get around that is you use these callback functions that are in here, that you basically say, hey, stop until this whole thing is completed what it's done, then do the next thing. All right. And speaking of which, the delay, the stop, and the finished methods here on page 276. All right. And as they mention on the next page, and they show some examples here, it says the delay method works as an alternative to the use of a one-time timer. That should make sense. Delay meaning stop for X number of seconds and then do something. The stop method stops the current animation. So if you're in the middle of something and somebody tries to do something else, you can tell the first thing to just stop, regardless of what it was doing. All right, and then do the second thing. The finish method, as it says, is similar to the stop method. All right, except that the properties of all queued animation jump to their end values. As it says, it's like, boom, you just jump to the end, then you stop. This is what I mentioned before, these easings, and there literally are a lot of different ways that you can do this. Okay? And easing, it says, determines the way an animation is performed. And some of them are shown here. They get into some of that stuff. There is an entire easing library that's got 20 or 30 different ways of doing things. And as I mentioned, you can have things fade in this, like this or whatever. All right. You can have things bounce. You can have things explode or implode. There's a lot of different things that you can do with this. And I was going to mention this. You don't have to go there, but I wanted to show it to you. Notice here, what I did was on the main page there, I clicked where it said plugins. All right. I'm not going to count these, but these are just some popular plugins. They're probably well over 1,000 right there. So that's code snippets that you can add in that somebody else has already written. Also, if I go out here and I type in jQuery plugin library, all right, then I get to plugins.jquery.com. Maybe that is the same thing. I guess it is. But again, notice if I start counting these, just how many of these there are. All right. Literally, they are in the there's well over 1,000 in here, probably closer to 2,000. The other thing I wanted to show you too, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a later class. If you say, you know, this is kind of cool, maybe I'd like to learn it. I don't know. If you go out to, probably gave you the wrong one, so. JqueryUI.com. Again, not a nice looking site, doesn't look like very much. But again, let's say that I want to learn about how to use an accordion. All right, one of those FAQ types of things. I can go over here, and there's about 30 things in here. But I can go down to accordion, I can grab that, and then notice it shows you the accordion, right? And down below it, there's a view source, which gives you all of the code. So if you wanted to write your own, that's another place that you can go, rather than just the API documentation that we talked about earlier. Right? All right. How to use advanced animated syntax techniques here on pages 280 and 281. Now, again, the author says, at this point, you probably already learned all of the methods and skills that you're going to want to build. No, that's not true. All right, you know where to look for that stuff. But until you've gone through some exercises when you actually do it, it's not going to make a whole heck of a lot of sense. Right? So it says figure 910 presents the advanced syntax of the animate method and the methods for working with cues. So you have control. If you don't know what a cue is, first of all, you do. But if you think you don't know what a cue is, the best example of a cue is, imagine it's the first day of class. And somebody here, they don't do it like that at this campus, you know, and they don't do it at most campuses anymore. But let's suppose there was a bookstore. It was a Rankin bookstore. So you go to the bookstore and you say, hey, I'm taking AWD1000. What are the books? Person comes in there, gives you the books, you pay for them, you leave, the next person comes up. That's a queue. That says the first person who was in line is the first person served. And the last person in line is the last person served. They're talking about the same kind of an idea here with commands. That commands get queued up. So, you'll do the first command, and the rest of them are kind of like in this, I don't know what you want to call it, a box, a barrel, or whatever, but they're in order. And that's when you use the chaining, it tells you which one then to do next. You can queue things up. You can also dequeue things, where you can say that you want something to run in the order in which you want it to run. All right? And the chapter ends, the last 3 or 4 pages that are in here end with, again, a simple carousel or slideshow that uses this stuff. Again, they use their own books here, and they create the HTML, and they show you the CSS, and then they show you the jQuery. All right? So again, this is an example of setting stuff up and doing it with this. Typically, if you want to set something up and you don't want to do a lot of animation and the like, rather than writing this many lines, you're going to write just a few, very few, sometimes one line to make it work. And again, I'll just leave you with that because we're done with the chapter. All right? But just to leave you, just to show you this, as I mentioned to you before with this, okay, if you look at all the code that's here, all right, if we look at every bit of code to make this thing right here work, how much of it is jQuery? The answer is this. That's it. You are telling it that they're using that function instead of document.ready. They're saying find the thing that was created with an ID of accordion and run the accordion method on it. So we're doing it with one line of code. All right, again, there's not very many special effects or anything in it. All right, and also you may or may not have noticed that when you run this, all right, how that one's open. And I believe that the way that this example is set up, very simply like this, one of them is always open. So if you don't want that, you are going to have to add some code. But the point is, to get something up there and working, it's very little code. Yes? You can, but you have to add some more code to do that. All right? So that was it. That's literally what I have. Now, you were supposed to have, by at least no later than tomorrow, the chapter 6 and 7 exercises that